In 2006, a pair of researchers from top schools in the U.S. set out to understand the role of religion in politics. They surveyed 3,000 people from across the country, some of them churchgoers, some of them not. They got a representative sample on a range of issues, like whether America should allow more immigration or dial it back, whether abortion should be outlawed or protected outright as a matter of choice or something in between, whether religion should play a bigger role or any role in American government. They asked whether government itself should be bigger or smaller. They asked where voters saw themselves on the political spectrum, which party they identified with, if any. Then they took all of that data and they crunched it down to make this book, American Grace: How Religion Divides and Unites Us. The book came out last October, the study of faith in American politics and American society. But as they were putting together the book, a funny thing happened, or not funny, depending on how you feel about it. The Tea Party was born in the middle of this in 2009 with its call for smaller government and no lower taxes or no taxes and yay guns, but also hands off our health care. The Tea Party billed itself as a secular political movement. This was not God and guns. This was don't tread on me and guns. This year, the authors of American Grace started work on the paperback edition of their book. Instead of just taking the old data and putting it between softer covers, they decided to update it. Since theirs was a book about changes in America, they decided to see how people in their original survey had changed. In particular, they decided to ask about who now identified with the Tea Party, which, remember, did not exist. The Tea Party did not exist when they first started asking all of these questions about faith and politics and policy back before. And then the answers came back. Turns out that the second strongest predictor of whether someone in the original survey would be a Tea Party supporter today was whether they believed back then that religion should have more influence in government. That was the number 2 strongest predictor. But the single strongest predictor of whether you were going to eventually become a Tea Party member was what party you belonged to in the first place. Overwhelmingly, the people who identified as Tea Partiers this summer called themselves Republican before the Tea Party ever existed. Whatever story the Tea Party wants to tell about itself, the data show that this new phenomenon, this new Tea Party phenomenon, is really just a new name for the same old religious conservative wing of the Republican Party. And one more fascinating thing, the authors of American Grace also decided to ask everybody, to ask the big wide range of Americans, how they felt about a range of groups and political leaders, from Barack Obama to poor people as a group, to gay people, to this new political group, the Tea Party. They asked about 24 different groups or individuals in all. And coming in last, coming in 24th out of 24th, was the Tea Party. Lower than Democrats, who had just lost control of the House only months before. Lower than Republicans, who had just taken over the House. Lower than Muslims, who had been villainized over a community center and mosque in downtown Manhattan. Lower than atheists, God bless them. At the very, very, very bottom, the Tea Party. That's what the research showed. That's just the data. Them's the numbers. Is Robert Putnam, a professor of public policy at Harvard and one of the 2 authors of American Grace. Professor Putnam, thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks. I'm very glad to be here. Why don't you just call me Bob the Professor?
Bob the Professor, very good. Thank you for putting your old database to such an interesting new use. Were you surprised by what you found when you went back into the second round of surveying?
Yeah, I was shocked, actually. David Campbell, my co-author, said we should ask about the Tea Party because he thought it would be related to the revisions of our book on religion. I said, look, it's a book about religion. It's not a book about politics. And so I believed the basic storyline in the public media, which is the Tea Party was a bunch of independents who were upset about the growth of government and were getting involved for the first time in politics. And he said, no, I don't think that's right, Bob. I'm betting that there's some relationship to the old religious right. And I said, well, let's ask about it and find out. And David won that bet. As you were saying before, of all the people who today in America support the Tea Party, about 80% of them were 5 years ago Republicans. And about 5% of them were 5 years ago, independents. This is not a movement of independents up from the grassroots. It's the Republican Party. But it's interesting to ask, well, did all Republicans back then now end up in the Tea Party? And the answer is no. Actually, the Tea Party supporters are less than half of all the people who favored the Republican Party. So the Tea Party movement represents a minority within the Republican Party.
And specifically, it is a minority that has differences of opinion, statistically significant differences of opinion with the rest of people you are surveying, and even the rest of Republicans, about the role of religion in government. But yet that hasn't really become part of their sort of Tea Party brand. Is that fair to say?
It isn't part of the Tea Party brand yet, but it certainly is a fact. I mean, actually, what we were then asking was, well, what differentiates the Republicans who ended up with the Tea Party from the Republicans who don't support the Tea Party? And you know, you might think, well, maybe it's the size of government. These Tea Party people are really upset about big government, and they're maybe even upset about Republican big government. And there's a little bit of that. But by far, the most important factor is that, and by the way, there's another factor too, which is these are the Republicans who are the most skeptical about racial minorities. They're the most uneasy about blacks and immigrants and so on. But the big difference, as you said, is that the Republicans who now ended up supporters of the Tea Party are highly disproportionately drawn from those Republicans who all along have favored a closer connection between religion and politics. They're more likely, those who ended up in the Tea Party are more likely to say religious leaders should take an active role in politics and encourage people to vote a particular way. They're more likely to say that politicians should be active religious leaders or active in expressing their faith. They're more likely to say it's a good idea if we mix religion and politics. And the Republicans, as well as the rest of the country, but the Republicans who are not supporters of the Tea Party, differ on those. Most Americans actually are moving in the direction of saying it would be better if we didn't have such a quite close entanglement between religion and politics. So most Americans are moving in the direction of saying, let's not have quite so much religion in our politics. But the Tea Party represents, purely so to speak, those Americans who are moving in the other direction and think it'd be great to have more religion in our politics.
Which is an interesting insight into how the how the Tea Party specifically is viewed by the rest of the country. People may be sort of intuiting that. One last question for you, specifically on that issue that you mentioned about skepticism or uneasiness about minorities. The issue of race and racism and racial sensitivity is obviously a very explosive one in American politics. What do you mean specifically when you describe them as skeptical or uneasy about minorities?
Well, they're much more likely to say that we ought to have less immigration rather than more immigration. That's, of course, a controversial issue in the country as a whole. But what distinguishes the folks, Republicans who ended up in the Tea Party from those who didn't, is that the ones who ended up in the Tea Party are much more firmly anti-immigration. I mean, you know, lots of other Republicans are anti-immigration too, but the Tea Party people are the ones who are really anti-immigration. And when we ask people to rate all these various groups that you've described, and I think your viewers have seen, the Tea Party people, the people who were going to end up in the Tea Party, were more likely to rate blacks and other racial minorities lower in that ranking of how you feel about different groups.
Robert Putnam, professor of public policy at Harvard. Thank you so much for your time tonight, for helping us understand this. I should tell our viewers that the hardcover edition of American Grace, co-authored with Notre Dame professor David Campbell, came out last year. The paperback one will appear early next year, and you can learn more on their website, which is americangrace.org, which we will link to from our blog. Professor Putnam, thank you again for your time tonight. I really appreciate it, sir.
Thanks very much, Rachel.